Yeah, welcome, ladies, to this conversation today. Good to have you in studio with us. And it's good to be back after just a few minutes break from session one. So hopefully everyone appreciated that quick tour through outer space. And apologies again for my lack of geographical knowledge about what happens out there with the planets and the stars. But hopefully you had some fun. And again, to tie these two sessions together here, one and two, and then as we even look forward to the rest of today, we set the stage, hopefully, with session one, talking about the complexities of this inventory, how they don't move from A to B. They circle back around and go every which direction. We got frenemies that are impacting the direction of this inventory. But this session is going to be the one where we really start to focus in on this missing instrument challenge that impacts that inventory that I just spent an hour diving in. And that's where Marty and Robin are going to come in with us today. So, ladies, welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's maybe start with a little bit more introductions. Obviously, Brett, gave you some bios here, but maybe give us a little bit more background about how y'all got into sterile processing in particular, like where that interest lies for you. And then also maybe your experience or maybe a fond memory around this missing instrument challenge. It doesn't have to be a fond memory. Maybe it's a bad memory around missing instruments. But let's start maybe first here with Robin.
Yeah, I've been an OR nurse for about 37 years and had the opportunity to work in some facilities where I had to be all things or be in charge of all things. But the one thing that really pushed me deep into SPD is when I worked for Vanderbilt before my current position, we opened an offsite SPD and case cart operations center. And I was the clinical operations person for that to make sure that all the instruments and all the case carts landed exactly where they needed to be at the right time for the right patient. And it really gave me a very fond understanding of all the things that have to do logistically to move something that somebody thinks is from point A to point B, but it's probably from point A to point M. So that really catapulted me into SPD and have loved it ever since.
Yeah, that story is so interesting, Robin, and I'm sure we're going to kind of pick up some of those themes here as we get into some of these questions, but it's a great example of exactly what I was talking about as we treat it, even if in the normal scenario that, hey, this device is missing, but we know it's at least in this building, right? Well, in your situation, maybe it's not. Maybe it's on its way across town to the reprocessing center. So it gets even more complicated when you're talking about that offsite reprocessing puzzle. So that's great.
Yeah.
Great point there. What about you, Marty? What's your story?
Well, I have been in sterile processing since about end of 2020, beginning of 21. I joined healthcare for the first time in January of 2020. Right before everything happened.
Crazy. Yeah. How about that timing, right?
It was great. I started at a different department in the hospital and was introduced to sterile processing because they had some data needs and putting some data to transition from paper and pencil to a tracking system. And once I was in the department and I saw everything moving and shaking and got to know the people, I said, this is where I need to be. So I joined the department and I was the implementation manager of the tracking system and helped get us online. So it's been a fun past couple of years. Our tracking system will be 2 years old in May. We should have a birthday party for it.
That's exactly what I was thinking, yeah.
And so we went from zero idea of where the missing instruments were to now being able to gather insight. And it's the beginning of a journey for sure.
Wow. Yeah, so you're saying that data has a role to play in missing instruments? Who would have thought? So we'll talk a little bit about data in this session, obviously, because it does have implications no matter what question is asked here. But, just so everyone is aware, and I think, if you've been looking at the agenda, but we've got another session coming up a little bit here later with Seamus, and he's going to dive into all kinds of data. He's a huge data head as well. So you're going to get data here. You're going to get data the next one. You're probably going to get data for the rest of the sessions today, because that's such an important piece of this puzzle. But I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder. I'll let you make that case here, Marty and Robin. But first, maybe let's start here at the beginning and start with the clinical impact of these missing instruments that we've talked so much about in promoting this event. Missing instruments. We're going to find these things. But Marty, what is the real impact when we just get to the bottom level of this thing? How does it impact the OR? How does it impact XPD, in your opinion and experience?
In my opinion and experience, it is all about the patient and them having what they need when they need it. And that is the clinical impact right there. Is we have to use the tools that we have to communicate with the OR. It's one of the worst when the set seems that it has everything there and everything is progressing in the OR with the patient being rolled back. Everyone's scrubbed in the room and they're getting everything set up. And then the one instrument that they need to start the case is missing. And then it's a madhouse scramble. Do we have another set sterile? Do we have another set available? Is this instrument somewhere else? Heaven forbid it's one of a kind and now we have to go find it.
Yeah, Robin, we've asked this question before on the podcast, but I'm not sure we've asked it in one of these conference settings. I'm going to ask it again based on what Marty just said and, your experience in the OR. In SPD, we kind of experience missing instruments through a phone call. And, sometimes the phone call is really dramatic, and we can sense a little bit about what's going on in the room just through the tone of the call. And sometimes it's maybe we don't really understand what actually just happened, and it's a restrained phone call that just says, "Hey, we need this device to this room as soon as you can." But who knows what was going on? Can you give us a little bit of that kind of clinical window into the OR of what can and has gone on in situations like Marty just described, when the case is proceeding and then boom, you realize you got a missing instrument problem?
Well, time is always of the essence, in the OR. You don't want your patient under anesthesia longer than they have to be. And so when you come across that one item that they need that isn't in there, everybody's anxiety actually goes up. There's a stress level in there because you have a patient on the table. You don't have what you need to proceed. And unfortunately, sometimes that comes in through a phone call. But we try to mitigate that as much as possible. But it does, it causes delays, and it causes the OR to be sometimes untrustful. That they don't trust that SPD is going to get them what they need, and so that creates another whole level of anxiety in the room. And it's a stressful environment up there anyway, right? Those of us who live it every day don't think about it at that granular level because it is our job, right? I think that if we thought about what we were doing every day, that we might all be stressed out too much. And so when there's a bump in the road, it just kind of elevates that to a level. And I often was told as a new nurse to be a duck and let things roll off your back, so that it wasn't really personal, but it was the level of urgency that was happening in the room. Not an excuse for bad behavior, but sometimes it's the situation, not the person. So all the things that she said are true, but it starts, even if you find it prior, it causes a delay in the case, which backs up the entire schedule for the day. And you could have a surgeon that potentially would have to use an instrument that he's not completely comfortable with to move forward. And that's never a good thing, because it is all about the patient.
You mentioned, Robin, the comment about trust and how missing instruments can break that trust so easily. And it doesn't take a lot of them, but I'm sure a lot of folks tuning in, I've kind of been scrolling down the attendee list as we've been talking here and just seeing all the different types of facilities, all corners of the universe out there. I know a lot of people have probably been in facilities, and they may be in one now, that has lost trust with the operating room specifically because of this missing instrument challenge, right? So what we're talking about here is not hypothetical, not it could happen, but it does happen, and it happens systemically. And so my follow-up to you, Robin, is why is this such a industry-wide problem? It's not like only this type of facility or only this kind of inventory, only this kind of tracking system or what have you. It seems like no matter where surgery is done, many times, unless you get the projects and the process together that many of us have been advocating for, but in general, it seems the status quo is everyone's going to be missing instruments. Why is that so systemic in your opinion?
I think part of it is that surgeries have become so complex, and there are so many instruments on the table. And some of them are duplicated. They get put in the wrong trays, not meaning to, I'm sure, but that does happen. You have, if you're in a teaching institution, we all know that certain times of the year comes new residents and medical students, and that creates a whole host of issues in itself. And I think that oftentimes people don't review their instrument trays like they would maybe their preference cards to see what can come out and what should stay in, to where, some trays get so big that those instruments never make it back into the right set. And I'm going to be honest, I've seen a surgeon throw instruments in the trash, right? Or in my prior role, I used to have somebody from the linen who would bring me a linen bag full of instruments that went off in towels or reusable drapes. And so I think it's a whole host of issues. And I think that the partnership between the OR and SPD to be able to work those problems together to identify where it's actually happening would be really beneficial. But, Rose Seavey once said, the relationship between the OR and SPD is like a bad marriage in need of counseling, right? And so I feel like that's part of it. They don't neither understand unless you have a really good program of taking them to SPD, the SPD personnel to the OR to see what happens in that room, right?
Yeah. I was going to jump in there about the relationships and how important that is. Just thinking about, we had 2 new sets, just one new set, 2 of each, rolled it out with the coordinator upstairs. We built the set, we ran through the count sheet, we took pictures of all the instruments, everybody upstairs and downstairs, they were supposed to know what they're doing. And yet that one instrument that we said, you're going to throw this away, please don't, went missing. Mm-hmm. And the first instinct sometimes, if that relationship is poor, is that finger pointing game of, you're the reason we're missing it. No, you're the reason. And the relationship there is important to say, okay, we know we rolled this out together. Now, how do we find it together? We've really kind of encouraged those relationship buildings in our department. So we said, we looked everywhere. We went through the trash. We looked in our sharps bin. What do we need to do to help find this instrument? And like you said, the coordinator went back. There was a student in the room that day. So she did her due diligence and she found it in her sharp spin. So the case of the missing instrument was solved and it was a good day, but that's not always the case.
Yeah,
Correct.
that context too that you both bring up, I think, is an interesting answer to this question, right? It's like, why is this so systemic? Well, it's likely because these relational challenges and these fractures are also so systemic between these two departments, which is an interesting scenario. It's not just healthcare. It's not just our situation. I think this is true in all kinds of different industries where you got two teams that rely on each other in high pressure situations. It's complex, and oftentimes there's issues that happen that impact each other negatively, and that just produces a lot of friction. And then add in, this is not like other industries because we have lives on the line here, and so it's just even more stressful, like Robin mentioned there. So that's a critical piece of the puzzle, as well as that communication piece too that you mentioned, Marty, of, hey, we've got to communicate on this proactively. And then also, when it fails, because there will be failure in any process, we've got to communicate that collaboratively in a way that everyone can share that ownership in the solution there. Getting back here, Marty, to the process of this missing instrument, this mystery, I guess, is what we're calling it in this session. What are the important questions I want to just get out here on the table for anyone in SPD that's tuning in who already knows this, anyone in the OR who probably also already knows this, but especially for any innovators and vendors or maybe quality folks, even administrators that are tuning in who may not know this important piece of the puzzle. And the question is, at what stage in the reprocessing cycle most often do we realize an instrument is missing from a tray?
I would say it's when you're sitting with the count sheet and you're wanting to make sure that the item is there and you're looking for it and then it's not.
And that's, so just to clarify again, for people who are not SPD, that's happening on the clean side.
On the clean side, yes.
After decontamination has happened, after mechanical cleaning has happened, after who knows how long it's been sitting on the clean side to be waiting to assemble, and then finally a technician will pull that tray 1 hour, 2 hour, 3, 4 hours after it came through. And then you're like, oh, by the way, we're missing that one thing from the case that everyone has now gone home. There's another procedure happening in that room, and now our chances of backtracking have gone down to almost nothing.
We've gotten to the point where, like, what we call our heavy hitters, the ones that are always missing, that we're looking for them intentionally in decontam. So when they come off the elevator and we're opening up that case cart, that's the first thing is, is that motor there? Is that attachment there? Is that one of a kind clamp there? And as soon as we see, like, it's not in the basket, it's not on the case cart, somebody needs to make a phone call. But that's not every instrument every time.
So, Robin, I'm assuming that this challenge is even more prominent if you're about to load these instruments on a truck and haul them across town. How did you confront that missing instrument and challenge of, hey, it could be a while until we even figure out what's not here that should be here, and then you add in transportation in the middle of it?
Right. So it is a bit of a challenge with the offsite. I have had some progress with certain services that have certain items that always go missing, and maybe it's not a countable case, right? Maybe it's not an open cavity and you don't have to count, but if you are consistently missing those same types of instruments, maybe you count just those in those trays and in those cases. Because you're right, if you do have some instruments that stay at the hospital due to many different reasons, you don't have very many, they have to be processed a certain way, they shouldn't travel, and then you have instrument trays that go to the offsite and you put your instrument in the wrong tray and it has to travel, we had to put some processes in place that immediately during assembly, that conversation is happening between the two sites. I've also had some places that I've put little discs in those so they can go to the other trays that were for that specific case, because they might not have come off the case card at the same time. If you can imagine, in an offsite, we get 20 case cards at the same time in decontam, right? And so we get a truckload instead of one or two at a time. So sometimes those discs help locate the trays that were in that case. And sometimes we just really get lucky. I mean, I had a very good relationship with the people who worked in decontam in my previous job role. And if they saw, a drill missing or something big like that, they would immediately call me, and I would immediately talk to the room and make that happen right then. So there's lots of ways to do that, but you have to catch it in time, and you have to make the people in the OR aware of some of that, some of those maybe not such great behavior that's happening. Like I said, surgeons don't like the way their pickups go together and just flip them in the kick bucket. Right. And they might do that behind your back. So it's all about having good communication when something like that happens. So,
and not to defend that kind of surgeon activity, because I think we all agree, even surgeons would say that's not what we should be doing. But, right. We can understand over time if we have let our surgeons down again and again and again, and they feel like, I have voiced how many times that these pickups are not aligning, or these are not the right pickups, or the pickups are not even there that I need. And that frustration in some sense can boil over. Not again that excuses their actions, or we've seen scopes, broken in half because they never want to see that scope again. Well, mission accomplished. You won't see that one again, right. I guess. But that plays out in a lot of different scenarios, and we'll talk about some of that too. But the same can kind of bleed over into the nursing staff, into the surgical tech staff, but even in the sterile processing staff too. If they feel like, hey, what I'm saying is missing in decontam is not actually being followed up on, Marty, and they begin to start feeling it's not even worth saying, it's not even worth looking, or voicing this, I should just process this as quickly as I can through decontam because nothing's really going to happen. How do you navigate that on the data side? It's just like Robin mentioned, we need to be communicating information back to the OR as quick, but also as consistently as possible. So how do you approach that in the world of data when it comes to what's not coming back to decontam that should be?
All right, so we are tracking at the set level and not the instrument level. So as things come through in decontam, that is, you're visualizing it. So that's not true data so much as it is like the individual's mind of data, right? More of a feeling. But then once we're to the assembly side and we're able to see, we just, there's trends. You get a report out of the tracking system and you line it up to see how often is the towel clamp missing from the major set. And if it's all 5 towel clamps every single time, I mean, the data just tells that story. But if you feel like that one time, the very expensive, the $30,000 piece goes missing and you're like, oh, this is such a problem. Well, they use it all the time, and this is the one and only time they've lost it. So this would be an outlier, and that you go off of that story and avoid some of the feelings that go with it.
So, Marty, you mentioned earlier one particular scenario or example of how you followed up on a missing instrument and you were able to capture it again. But can you give us maybe some other general responses or typical responses when you identify at the assembly stage, just like you said, okay, something's missing. Kind of walk us through what typically happens next, just those step-by-step responses that your technicians would take or should take.
All right, so you have a technician that knows what they're doing, and they're at the assembly station, and they're putting this together, and they see, man, that instrument's missing. And we start sounding the alarm. Everyone's talking about it. You've got the technician at the workstation going to the supervisor who's, out on the clean side with them, and then maybe that's being escalated to the office, to the SPD manager, maybe the director, and everybody's on the phone or getting on the elevator to go upstairs, and we're saying, where is this? What's going on? And it's sometimes just that real time, that those are the steps that we're taking. Is we're going to the site of where it started, and that's going to be the bedside in the OR. Is this case still going? Has it finished? Where is the case cart? Where are the OR attendants? Who was the last person that had their hands on it? Did they count in the room? Do they know that they counted it? Did they have somebody upstairs that was just as attention detailed that says, oh, I know for sure that I put it back in the basket?
Right.
Those questions are asked all along the way. And then, sometimes we'll have the director on the phone saying, this is the second time I've called you about this today. What's going on up there? So we're holding everyone accountable at every level.
So, Robin, how do you guard against, when we use that accountability word, which is really important, what Marty brings up is, she said, like, we hold people accountable, but it's a mutual accountability that we're talking about here, because we're holding the operating room accountable for what they should be doing in returning instruments. We're holding the SPD accountable for what they should be doing in completing trays. How do we keep that accountability from doing exactly what we talked about earlier, which is the fractured relationships of leading toward more blame game and distrust? Because I've seen it go the direction of accountability equals, I gotcha. You messed up. I got a picture, and now we're going to slam you to the wall with it. How do you guard against that?
I think it comes from both areas understanding what happens in those areas. I'm an old nurse, right? So I started in SPD. When I started in the OR, my first month was an SPD, and then I learned to scrub, and then I learned to circulate. And so there was an understanding of what you saw come down, right? If you saw it in a mess and you continuously saw things missing, it was very disheartening, as you said before. I feel like nothing's happening. But on the flip side of that, I think especially today, with the shortage of scrub techs and the shortage of nurses, that there's such a push to put people in those roles very quickly that, especially with the new employees, there's not enough orientation to how you get what you need, right? It's important for them to understand that there are a lot of things going on down at SPD. And, especially, if they need an instrument turned over or a tray turned over, I used to say, there's not somebody in decontam waiting with the catcher's mitt with nothing to do, waiting for your tray. Right. And, I think it's that mutual understanding to help bridge that gap, to make them understand what you do on the front end in SPD. This is how that affects in the OR. And then, in the OR, what you do there is the start of what happens in SPD. And so I really think it's about education and educating them to why why you need to work in a partnership, why it needs to be together instead of that finger pointing, because it's a team sport, right? Working in the OR is a team sport, and there's no room for the siloed behavior.
Right. And taking that back to that accountability word again is, they're responsible for how they send it to us, and we're responsible for sending it back up. But they're also trusting us to let them know when it's missing.
Right.
Like if I was upstairs in the room and I was the one that accidentally had it in the trash, I would want the phone call from Deacon Tam to say, hey, you forgot to give me this. And then you can say, oh, okay. And then you find it and give it to them. So that helps eliminate some of that blame game, is to say, we are helping each other. This is a partnership. We're on the same team.
Right. Yeah, anyone who's watching this live, if you're tuned in live, you can see the emojis coming across the screen here. So we're getting a lot of responses to this conversation, which is good. I think it means we're on the right track with things. And, specific to those emojis, I want to just add a comment here, and we'll move on. The next question is on the topic of human factors to all of this. But, one of the human factors that I think is very important to bring up, but it's probably needs to be its own session, is the impact that a single toxic individual can have on this entire scenario. If you get one tech or one OR nurse or one sterile processing technician who just doesn't care about anything that we've been talking about, they want it their way. They don't want to be on the team, like you said, Robin. And they're going to emote that frustration unprofessionally, and they're going to blame, and they're going to try to catch people, and they're going to try to ruin people's days if there is a mistake. The only way to deal with that individual is for leadership to hold them accountable. And what I mean is likely get them off the bus onto a different bus where they're going to be happier, and the entire team is going to benefit from just removing that cancer. Now, can toxic people change? Yes. Most of the time they don't want to change, especially if they've been in these scenarios for many years. But I think we've all worked with those kind of people that we just wish that their manager or their director would just wake up and be like, no one likes this person, and this person doesn't like anyone. And they're just ruining this entire experience of patient care, especially when it comes down to these kind of situations where you need open communication and accountability and collaboration. You just can't get those with that individual. So anyways, that's an aside. So let me ask you, Marty, back to the topic at hand. We've been talking a lot about the process piece. We've talked about the data piece and the communication piece. Talk to us about the human factors piece, because we're not talking about robots that we can just design and code to do exactly what we want to do. We're talking about humans that have to respond to things.
Sometimes I feel like those humans some of them can be quite robotic.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, like how do we navigate that scenario then? Because we're wanting perfection in our trays, and the patients need complete trays, and then we drop humans in the scenario. So how does that impact all of this?
Communication, and you're right, it does depend on leadership, because they are the ones that have the ability to have the conversation in a way that it will be heard, I believe, to change behavior or action. So I think Robin made a mention of folks in orientation. People, they don't know what they don't know. Sometimes I think folks come in and they've oversimplified the idea. They get that continuum of care in their mind. Okay, it was dirty, now it's clean, it'll be sterile, it'll get used. It's so much more than that. And then as folks are getting into it, it can become distracting. Is this sharp? Did I use the compressed air to blow it out? There's a million things going on. I had to answer the phone. The sterilizer started beeping. We have to explain a lot of that environment to new employees and say, you need to be able to stay at your workstation and stay focused while that set is open and you're processing. And when we get a quality feedback report, or we get a missing items instrument report, whatever it is that we've set up to rely on the data, we can go back and we can say, hey, Sally Mae, you are consistently having bone stay in your patellar clamp. Like, what's going on? What is it about this instrument that, you can't seem to get over this hurdle so that we can send it up the right way every time? And it's specific scenarios. You can't generalize it. It's not an always situation. It's each individual has their own story. Sometimes I even think about, did you use your magnifier? Are you using your lights? I think about how old somebody is sometimes and think, like, do you have the tools and resources you need to see the correct way? And the human factor, it's just so important. We rely on these people to have their hands and their eyes on these instruments that are being used on the patient. And I think I go back often to, I'm actually told not to get your head out of the reports and go out there and talk to people sometimes, right? Because I'm always like, well, what is the data telling us?
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important, right? Because even in the first session, I talk a little bit about the why behind something happened and the who behind something that happened. But you bring up a good nuance to that. For coaching purposes and improvement purposes, you often do need to still speak to the who and identify the who in the process so that you can understand exactly, hey, was it your light wasn't on? Well, you may not be the only tech who didn't have their light on for processing. And so that might be a problem that we need to scale out now to the rest of the department. Or you could be the only one who just didn't have their light on. And so it's not a complete process change or a new policy that needs to happen. We just need to remind Susie, hey, make sure to turn on your light next time, because that'll help you see what you're investigating here. So
yeah. And we've had folks that say, like, if I'm the one that made the mistake, please don't put it in the staff meeting, because if it is that one person mistake, they want that individual feedback. It's not until everybody left the light off that you say, all right, this needs to go into daily huddle. We need to talk about it. And then it needs to go into our monthly staff meeting so that we make sure we've wrapped it up. And then you go on.
Right.
How you deliver that feedback is important as well. Yeah.
So we're getting some comments here in the comment thread about background noise. So I'm going to ask for both y'all, because I don't know where it's coming from, but if you'll just mute your mic when you're not talking, that'll probably help control the background noise. But I'm going to go back to Robin here next on the human factor piece, Robin. So we've talked a lot about the human factor piece on the sterile processing side, but I'm kind of curious to get your insight on the OR side for human factors. How does that play a role in getting at this consistent process piece that I think we all agree has to happen in order for complete trays to go up to the OR and complete trays to come back down? How do humans impact that goal?
Well, I think especially with new, you've been to school, right? But you've done some clinical, but maybe you chose to work at a place that you didn't do clinical at. It's a new environment. I'm just going to use a teaching institution as an example. There are lots of moving pieces and parts, and they do very complicated cases. And so it can be overwhelming, and some places, I think it's important for you to have like a portfolio. If you're going into orthopedics, here's your portfolio of trays that you will use. Here are the count sheets for you to look at. And these are our high volume trays as part of their orientation, because it can be overwhelming, right? Especially for new people. I mean, also on the flip side of that, there are people who have been there for a very long time, and you might put a new process in place like that. I know there's some different thoughts about having count sheets on the table and things like that. But, I think sometimes you have to create processes that incorporate those newer people, or, the travelers that we have in our environment now in the OR, because the expectation for travelers is to be able to come right in and do whatever. I have been a traveler myself. And so it's a lot of pressure. I kept my count sheets, so I knew where things went. Some places don't allow you to have them on the table anymore. So, creating processes to help them be successful, because there are a lot of failure points that could happen just from the sheer volume of instruments and trays that you have on those tables these days. And so, and the pressure for turnover, I got to get all of this out so that I can get my next case in. That has a lot to do with it as well. And so I think that you have to just make processes that include the new world we live in, right? We don't have a lot of old scrub techs and nurses anymore. It's a new generation that's coming through, and so you have to be where they are and create processes to include that.
Yeah, we had a comment a little bit earlier that says when we have 60 instruments per tray or 150 instruments per tray, and you got multiple trays coming back in these case carts in the decontamination area, it's very similar to what you're saying. You got a lot of instruments on that back table, and I didn't realize I was probably 5 years into my career before the first OR nurse told me that, sometimes we got these techs or these nurses that are relieved in the middle of the case for their lunch break. Someone else closes the case, and they're not the ones that opened up all these instruments, and now they got to put them all back. And to complicate matters even more, on the compliance side, we're down in SPD taking all the colored tape off. It was a great help. We're taking all of the little colored dips off the handles where it was real easy. All the red ones go together, all the yellow ones go together. No more. So, your point about the responsibility to really know these instruments at a detailed level by sight, because in the OR, unlike in SPD, when we have all these great pictures that Marty mentioned, that we've got it all lined out on this hopefully very structured kind of tracking system in the OR, you're like, well, this is what it's called. I need to know what it is just by looking at it, and now I need to know which tray it goes into on these various trays. And so that complexity, adding in the human factor that we've been talking about, it's a very real challenge. And if we're short-circuiting orientation, which I know you didn't say that, but I think, many of us kind of feel that way. We would like to have a little bit longer to orient staff, to expose them, especially in cross-department, cross-functional training and exposure. You just lose a lot of that confidence that can be gained through that. So great point there. Marty, let's say that we have an issue at my facility that we're missing towel clamps. I want to get into some practical, very specific, not that we haven't been talking practical, but I want to get into some very specific practical applications, I guess, of what we've been talking about so far. So let's say I'm missing towel clamps. What are some best practices, or what are some strategies that you would recommend for how to approach and sustain the change that we would implement to fix these the mystery of the missing towel clamps?
Our towel clamps were missing.
Okay.
It was a mystery.
Great example, right? Okay.
We're thinking we have a drawer, so we don't have a pegboard. We have drawers. We have drawer stock. And we have a drawer full of towel clamps, so many. And we've just ordered 20 more. One time we ordered the wrong kind. They weren't sharp enough. And at one point, this drawer is overflowing. And the next thing you know, it's empty. We're like, what has happened to these towel clamps? They're in every set. Are they being thrown away? What's happening? And I, as a non-clinical person new to healthcare, I'm like, well, what is a towel clamp? Where is it used? How is it used? Why is it used? You have to ask those who, what, when, where, why questions at the beginning of every single investigation. As soon as you start to unravel the mystery. And we got on the elevator and went upstairs. Where is it used? Where are the towel clamps? And lo and behold, there they are on the poles around the table, at the nurse's circulating station, on the anesthesia table, because in their mind upstairs, this is going on the outside of the clinical or the sterile field. This is clipping some drapes up. This is towel clamping, but not towel clamping somewhere in that surgical field. So I'm like, oh, okay, so this is what they're used for. This is how the OR understands this tool. We need to educate them. No, this is on our count sheet. Yes, we do want this back. And then we have to regularly do sweeps, and we'll go on walks upstairs, mostly, at the end of the day between when the OR really stops those scheduled cases and we've got a moment that we can walk through some empty rooms, and we pick up our bandage scissors and our towel clamps and other things that the nursing staff in the room thought, you said earlier, pocket. The P word, pocket. Yep. We're like, okay, well, let's go and empty their pockets. And then that mystery was no longer so mysterious, that we were able to go and find through asking questions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful insight on, asking how is this used? At what stage in the procedure is it used? What are some other secondary uses outside of just the directly clinical use that it could be used? And then that regular proactive, I think, is a word maybe that you didn't use, but that's what you were describing, of going out there ahead of time and saying, we know that this has happened in the past. Let's get eyes and ears in this space to see if we can't capture some of those again before they end up in the trash and they're unrecoverable in certain scenarios. What about you, Robin? Do you have any specific examples like this? Like that towel clamp example was great from Marty. What's a project like that you've worked on that you saw success in?
She mentioned the bandage scissors. So my specialty was orthopedic trauma. And so everyone in those rooms wanted the bandage scissors out of our ortho tray. Let me cut let me cut the dressing off, or let me do this, or let me do that. And we were having such a problem at one facility that I actually worked at before I was actually in SPD, and they were pocketing in them. So leadership said, okay, we're spending X amount of money on replacing bandage scissors. How about we just buy all of y'all bandage scissors, right? And so everybody got bandage scissors, and our spend on replacing bandage scissors went down. I still have mine to this day. So
awesome.
It's, like Marty said, you have to figure out what's happening with those ones that consistently go missing. And again, I do think it's that they don't really understand all the steps that it has to go through. If I take a pair of scissors, surely they have another pair of scissors downstairs to replace it. Right. That's the thought process. But I also think that sharing the instrument spend for missing instruments with the OR is important for them to understand, hey, we're spending, $1 million a year replacing missing instruments. We need your help to fix that. And I think I mentioned before, if you're consistently missing the same instruments out of certain trays that are usually on non-countable cases, have them count those specific instruments. I think that you have to look at the problem and what might be the best solution for that particular thing.
Robin, I like that you mentioned the spend, because that reminds me of the beginning of this month. The beginning of March, we went to a peri-op services. I say a couple of members of the SPD team. We were in the room with the OR director, managers, educators, and I brought a handout on February data that says X amount of instruments were added back from backstock. You sent it down missing. We couldn't find it. We've now added it from backstock. There's a cost to that. We're always refilling backstock. So when you take from it, it's dollars. And we put the amount of instruments and the number of dollars, and the OR director says, are you telling me that I threw away $16,000 worth of instruments last month? I was like, well, maybe. That's the story that this data is telling us, and that hit in your pocket gets people interested sometimes. They're like, okay, well, then what do we have to do to get that number to go down? Next time you bring us some data, is that going to be less? So, well, how does my team impact the bottom line of the organization?
Yeah, we've talked to folks, and I've done this at in my previous facilities as well, that have back in the day, you could print out a photo of a used car that maybe cost $16,000. I don't think you could get a used car these days even for $16,000. But to visualize and compare that, like, what does that dollar amount actually mean, Marty? Like you said, it's like, like we just threw an entire used car in the trash, or it wasn't the trash. Like, it's just not here anymore. We spent what we could have spent to buy a new car or used car, or a lot of times, going back to kind of what Robin was alluding to, is you've got this desire to have instrumentation at the ready. And many times we're operating in facilities that don't have adequate inventory to support the volume that we have. And then we've got this spend over here that could be allocated, instead of replacing missing instruments, could be allocated to create new trays in your inventory to support your surgical volume, so that the turnovers would be reduced. And so a higher satisfaction at the nurse and at the provider level. There's all kinds of things you could do with that money besides just replace, because of the human factors or the broken process or the lack of communication that we've been talking about here. And I think that's just a great highlight, to bring those numbers in front of people. And that's actually, with the 5 minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit about numbers. Again, I know we're going to have an entire session that's going to dig into the data here in a bit, but Marty, I'll let you go first because you're the self-proclaimed data head. I think, Rob and I also love data and we operate off of data, but you kind of presented yourself as the data nerd here. So, what else besides spend? What are those other data points that you think is really important for folks that are tuning into this, maybe new to the real scope of this missing instrument problem, or kind of what to do with it? Like, where would you tell them to turn and look first if they're going to be both capturing but also utilizing data?
Mm-hmm. So I think about breaking it down into those bite-sized pieces after you've figured out what's missing, maybe what set it is or what instrument it is. Then you can get into a specific. You might realize that 50% of these missing instruments are coming from ortho, and that it's when Dr. Z is in room 1 on Mondays and he hates working on Mondays. Maybe he's throwing away all the instruments. It's just, that's the story. Sometimes we look at it and we'll say, all right, Dr. J was in room 2 on Wednesday and we had a spike in missing instruments. People look at the data, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense, because they know the people behind the numbers.
Right.
Then the numbers are always, they're telling the truth, they're telling the story. You can't really hide from that. And so that's why I think it's important to have access to the data, to be able to play with those numbers, look at the numbers, break it down into where did it go missing, when did it go missing, what can we do to get ahead of it? I loved Robin's example of, just give everybody a pair of bandage scissors. I was already thinking, well, do they need to increase the number that's on the count sheet in the set? Do they need to have enough coming up sterile for every case? I'm thinking throw more in there. But then what else? That's really what we've done, is that OR piece is where we feel it going missing, and then having the data support that feeling, so we can then take that action that's supported by the data to address the specific behaviors to then hopefully see a change in those numbers.
Yeah, well, and as you said, you're bringing that data then to those meetings and those conversations. So it's not just like, hey guys, we feel like there's a problem here, or trust me when I tell you there's a lot of things that are going missing, but now you're actually able to put those numbers in front to build that conversation, that collaboration that I think we've all discussed here, that you got to have. This isn't a problem that can be solved just from the manager in SPD or the coordinator in SPD or even, the OR director. It's going to take an army and a village to address this, all the way back from like what Robin brought up to how we're orienting our OR staff, to also how much time we're giving technicians in decontam if we want them to really start looking at these trays with eyes toward missing instruments. It's going to take longer to manually decontaminate, because traditionally we haven't asked that of our teams. And so there's a lot of dynamics here that you're going to have to get buy-in around. What about you, Robin, on the data side? You got a favorite data point on this missing instrument conversation or two that you want to bring up here before we wrap?
Yeah, I'm a true believer in sending that missing trays that are on the missing instrument cart because
Oh, yeah.
the instruments are on order. I'm a true believer in sending that out so you can see what that number looks like every day. And if you need to specifically send it for service lines, I've done that as well. But it's very powerful to say, oh my, there's 100 instruments on the missing instrument cart. And look, 12 of them are mine as a leader, right?
Right.
So
yeah, you
that's
know what?
using,
That's so important. I'm so glad you brought that up too, because that's a great example of the proactive approach to this that we highlighted earlier. Because typically the experience is the OR doesn't know that a tray is missing instruments until it's the one that ends up in their case cart. And, hopefully it's tagged and it says it's missing, and that's frustrating enough. But if it's not tagged and they discover it later, that's super frustrating. But then to your point, hey, like we can actually communicate this before the trays are even pulled for the cases and, sent up to the room so everyone and their mama knows, hey, this is the scale and the scope of the missing instrument problem. And that goes to something that I always remind folks is, especially as sterile processing leaders, it can be scary to say how big the problem is, because you don't want people to look at you and be like, oh, like, he's not doing his job. He's the SPD manager. He's got like 1,000 missing instruments out of his inventory. Like, that's horrible. But if you hide that number and no one knows the true scope, you're never going to get the resources and the support and the buy-in that you need. Like Robin just mentioned, you need awareness. And the bigger the problem is, the bigger the buy-in and resources and support that you're going to need to fix it. So you got to surface that information. That's just terrific advice there.
Yep. And I know we're getting up there on time, Hank, but I just wanted to say sometimes
I'll
with
give you the last word.
Those KPIs, those key performance indicators, those data points, that when you come together as a sterile processing team and work on it together, and you're able to see the missing instruments go from 100 to 25, the camaraderie and morale boost that creates within the department, I think, is very important as well.
That's terrific. Well, Marty, Robin, you absolutely killed it on this conversation. We can tell by the hundreds and hundreds of emojis that have been shared through the last 60 minutes. But we appreciate your passion and your insight. And yeah, thank you for being a part of this Lost in Space event today.
Thank you.
thank you.